Hazel Monroe bent to pick up a bruised apple from her porch steps when she noticed the envelope flapping in the wind, bold red letters stamped, HOA compliance warning. The envelope had been wedged behind the railing, the wind teasing it like a loose flag in protest. Hazel squinted, brow knitting as she straightened, her knees quietly arguing with her back. She dusted off her apron and took the envelope in one hand, the apple in the other, and walked inside. The old screen door squealed its usual greeting. In the kitchen, she passed Earl's toolbox still tucked beneath the pantry. He used to say, she murmured, no one's ever find a porch swing for swinging. She set the apple in the compost bin, the envelope on the counter, and stirred the pot of squash soup simmering low. The smell was rich with rosemary and a hint of butter, mingling with the slow tick of the wall clock and the faint rustle of wind beyond the windows. Hazel washed her hands, dried them on a dish towel that had seen better embroidery, and finally opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick and stiff, like it was proud of what it carried. Notice of violation, non-compliant exterior fixtures. Your property has been flagged for the following: decorative shutters outside HOA approved pallet, wooden rocking chair obstructing porch line of sight, porch swing considered non-standard structure. Action must be taken within 14 calendar days to avoid formal sanction. Hazel sighed and placed the letter beside the cooling cornbread. She didn't feel angry, just tired, in the way that only constant small indignities can create. She wiped her hands again and glanced toward the window. A few leaves blew across the yard, crisp and copper, as if the trees themselves were unsettled. An hour later, she stepped into the Brookwell General Store. The bell above the door gave a happy chirp. "Well now," said Della from behind the counter, "look what the wind blew in. You look like you've seen a ghost, or at least a fine." "Close enough," Hazel said, setting a pack of canning lids and a tin of baking soda on the counter. "The HOA's decided my porch swing is too lively." Della rolled her eyes. "Next they'll be ticketing wind chimes for excessive optimism." A man by the bread shelf chuckled. "They flagged my mailbox last spring. Said it leaned." Hazel handed over exact change, then paused. "Is it leaning?" "Sure," he said. "Same as my knees." As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sun caught the edges of the maple leaves just right, making the street look like a painted postcard. The town felt familiar but strained, like a tune played slightly off-key. At home, Ivy was waiting on the porch with a small tin of pumpkin muffins. "You got it too, huh?" she said, nodding toward the envelope in Hazel's hand. Hazel gave a half-smile. Apparently the porch swing's threatening the visual order. "I got fined last spring for having mums that were too colorful. Too joyful," they said. As if morning beige was the HOA's seasonal theme. They sat in silence a moment, sipping tea and watching Boone, the neighbor's old basset hound, snuffle the base of the mailbox. The next evening was the monthly HOA meeting at the community center. Hazel hadn't planned to attend, but something in her bones, perhaps her husband's voice lingering in the toolbox, nudged her forward. She wore her blue cardigan, the one with the loose button she kept meaning to fix, and brought a tin of cornbread wrapped in a towel. Delilah Crane stood at the front, polished as ever, clipboard in hand like it was a badge of command. Her voice rang out across the folding chairs, "Our purpose remains consistent, to uphold the standards that preserve Brookwell's beauty and harmony." Hazel sat quietly in the third row, listening. Beside her, Ivy muttered something about harmony being a four-letter word when misused. Delilah continued, "We've identified several properties currently in non-compliance. It's not personal, it's policy." Hazel raised her hand. Delilah hesitated, then gave a tight smile. "Yes, Ms. Monroe." Hazel stood slowly. "Would you say my porch is a threat to property values?" "It's not about threat," Delilah said smoothly. "It's about cohesion. We simply aim for community consistency." Hazel held her gaze. "And what do we do with character?" The room went still for a breath, then moved on like nothing had been said. Hazel left before the cookies were passed around. Back home, she set the cornbread tin on the kitchen table and opened the drawer beneath the window. Her fingers brushed against the edges of old documents, deeds, receipts, zoning letters from decades ago. She reached down to the cabinet under the stairs and pulled out Earl's rusting file box. The latch was stiff. Inside were folders labeled in his handwriting, some yellowed with age. She thumbed through, pausing when she saw it, zoning, 1974. That evening, Hazel finds a yellowed envelope in her late husband's box labeled zoning, 1974. She raises one brow. "Don't change a thing," Lydia said, setting her suitcase by the porch swing. "You could sell this aesthetic for thousands a night." Her boots made a soft thump on the porch planks as she stepped back, one hand on her hip, surveying the chipped shutters, the wind chimes Hazel had hung in the 70s, and the braided rug rolled up against the front door to stop the draft. "Honestly, Nana, this place is halfway to being on a magazine cover. The good kind." Hazel smiled but didn't answer immediately. She lifted Lydia's tote bag and nudged the screen door open with her shoulder. "Come inside before you talk yourself into rebranding my life." The kitchen was warm and smelled of baked apple and cinnamon. A tray of apple crisp sat on the counter, its oat topping just starting to caramelize at the edges. The old transistor radio near the window played soft gospel from a local station, fuzzing slightly during the higher notes. Lydia set her coat on the chair and took in the room. "You haven't changed a thing since I was little." Hazel handed her a mug of cider, steam curling above it. "Why fix what still works?" She placed the mug gently onto a coaster cut from her grandmother's quilt. "This place holds more than memories," she said. "It holds people." Lydia took a sip and smiled. "It tastes like home." They sat at the kitchen table as late afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains. Hazel passed over the newest letter, unfolded and still sharp at the creases. Lydia read it in silence, one eyebrow lifting. "Non-standard porch swing," she said. "Decorative shutters, obstructing architectural cohesion." She looked up. "Is that a real phrase?" Hazel nodded. "Apparently, it's a violation to have character." Just then, the mail slot clattered. Hazel stood and retrieved another envelope from the floor, shaking her head before she even looked at it. "2 in a week," she muttered. She opened the door to find Hank, the mailman, retreating with his usual slow gait. "Sorry, Miss Hazel," he called over his shoulder. "It came pre-stamped. I just delivered them." Hazel waved him off, holding the envelope between two fingers like it might bite. Lydia watched her return to the table and gently set the second violation notice beside the first. "You ever consider just out-charming them?" Lydia asked. Hazel laughed. "With what? Extra pie?" "I'm serious," Lydia said. "Don't fight them. Redefine the whole picture. You've got zoning. You've got a house with soul. You could turn this place into a boutique stay, heritage lodging. Every room tells a story." Hazel tilted her head. "A bed and breakfast?" "No, better. Not folksy. Something curated. Hazel's hearth. 3 rooms max, authentic Southern hospitality. You've already got more character than half the Airbnbs in Nashville." Hazel shook her head, amused. "Your generation always trying to repackage everything." "I'm not talking about changing anything," Lydia said. "I'm talking about inviting people in to see it." Hazel stood and walked to the sideboard. "And the HOA?" "You'd be operating legally," Lydia replied. "Especially if that zoning letter from the 70s is still valid." Hazel turned, brow raised. "It is. Earl never trusted city updates, so he kept everything. It's in the file box under the stairs." Lydia pulled out her laptop and opened a folder labeled Design Thesis, Senior Year. "One of my projects was about repurposing historical homes for modern stays. I always thought of your house, but didn't want to say anything back then." Hazel chuckled softly. "You were afraid I'd kick you out for suggesting it?" Lydia grinned. "Maybe. Or afraid I'd want to stay forever." They spread paperwork across the kitchen table. Lydia sketched a rough floor plan on the back of an old church bulletin. "We'd only need to designate guest rooms, show the town we're adding value. You're not just preserving the past, you're giving it purpose. Hazel watched her granddaughter's hands move swiftly, drawing boxes for rooms, labeling nooks and corners with soft pencil. Granny Monroe would have loved this mischief, she said. She once hosted the entire church choir on accident. Didn't send anyone away. Outside, the wind rattled the porch swing. Ivy tapped on the screen door with a tin in her hands. Thought you might want some warm bread pudding, she said. That wind's got opinions today. Hazel opened the door. Come in and witness a rebellion in progress. They laughed as Ivy stepped inside and peeked at Lydia's sketch. Well, I'll be. You're bringing back the hearth. We're thinking about it, Hazel said, though the look she gave Lydia said more. Ivy placed the tin on the counter and Saturday, you won't be alone in this. Folks miss the old days, Hazel. They just don't know how to say it. Night settled in soft and early. After Ivy left, Hazel lit the porch lantern and closed the curtains. She opened the drawer next to the pantry and pulled out a folded town map, edges softened by time. There's something else I never filed away. Hazel tied a new ribbon to the gatepost, plaid, warm-toned, defiant in the morning sun. Below it, a handmade sign, Hazel's Hearth, opening soon. The fabric fluttered lightly in the cool breeze, catching the first amber light that spilled through the maple canopy above. A layer of frost still clung to the grass, crisp and temporary, like breath on glass. Inside, the house was a quiet flurry of motion. Lydia stood on a step stool, adjusting lace curtains in what used to be the sewing room. Hazel polished the wood frame of the vintage mirror that now hung above the washstand. You know this place has bones, Lydia said, not looking down. Real bones. Not just layout and materials, story. Hazel smiled faintly. She's held a lot of story. Might be time she shared some. Frank knocked on the open door with the edge of his boot and stepped in holding a small bucket of nails and a level. You're stirrin' the pot, Hazel, he said. Hazel glanced over her shoulder, eyes twinkling. Well, someone's gotta bring flavor back. He helped Lydia shift an old wardrobe from the hall to the guest room. The piece creaked indignantly, but settled into its new place with a kind of quiet pride. Frank dusted his hands and straightened up. She's lookin' good in here. Ivy arrived next, a canvas tote on one arm, a bundle of folded linens on the other. These belong to my mother, she said, smoothing a corner of embroidery. She believed good dreams lived in good thread. Hazel took the linens with care, pressing them to her chest for a moment. Then they'll carry someone kindly through the night. As the hours passed, the house shifted. Bundles of dried lavender were tucked into baskets beside the beds. A small butter churn lamp was placed on the hallway table. Lydia framed 3 handwritten recipes and hung them in the entryway: cornbread, sweet potato pie, and buttermilk biscuits, all in Hazel's careful script. Garrett arrived mid-afternoon, clipboard in hand, but without the usual starch in his step. He lingered at the edge of the porch for a moment before Hazel waved him in. Compliance check, she asked, though her tone was gentle. He nodded. Just observing today. His eyes swept across the porch, freshly restained, lined with rocking chairs softened by hand-sewn cushions. He stepped inside slowly, taking in the photos on the hallway wall, the scent of lemon oil and cedar. This was your husband's? He asked, pointing to a framed black and white photo of a man with suspenders and a gentle smile, standing beside an enormous turkey. Hazel nodded. Thanksgiving, 1976. He swore the bird was plotting revenge. Garrett almost smiled. My aunt thinks heritage means overly large clocks and plastic cornucopias. Your aunt, Hazel said mildly, thinks control is love. He didn't answer. Instead, he paused near the table where the guest book sat, blank, its pages eager. What happens if this catches on? He asked. Then maybe more people remember where they came from, Lydia said, stepping into the hall with a folded quilt. And maybe Brookwell feels a little more like itself again. Garrett nodded, scribbled a few notes, then paused. This is not what I expected. Hazel tilted her head. Neither were most good things in my life. That evening, Lydia posted a sneak preview on her design blog, Hazel standing on the porch with a tea towel in hand, Ivy arranging hydrangeas in a milk jug, Frank leaning against the new railing. She titled it Heritage Reimagined, Small-Town Hospitality with a Story to Tell. By morning, they had their first booking. A retired librarian from Alabama left a note in the online comments, came for the creaky floors. Staying for the soul. Hazel smiled when Lydia read it aloud. She went to the guest book, still blank, and pressed a dried dogwood blossom into the first page. It crinkled faintly, like a whisper. She stood at the kitchen window, watching as the sun melted the frost off the grass, the ribbon at the gate catching the breeze. The next morning, a typed notice is pinned to Hazel's fence, unpermitted commercial use, HOA review pending. Delilah stood at Hazel's gate, clipboard clutched like a baton. This is not a permitted business, Ms. Monroe. Her words clipped through the crisp air like scissors, slicing straight through the late October stillness. The wind rustled the cornstalks tied neatly to the porch rails, scattering a few leaves across the unpaved walkway where Delilah's shoes sank ever so slightly into the soft earth. Hazel leaned against the doorframe, apron still dusted with flour, a whiff of cinnamon pecan bread drifting from the open kitchen window. She took her time setting down the pie dish she'd been cooling, wiping her hands on a towel as if the HOA president hadn't just declared a minor war on her front step. "You always know you're doing something right," she said, stepping down to meet her visitor, "when someone brings rules before biscuits." Delilah's jaw stiffened. She adjusted her scarf like it might shield her from Hazel's tone. Garrett stood just behind her, clipboard in hand, though he seemed more focused on the pumpkin by the steps than the paperwork in front of him. "I'm here in an official capacity," Delilah continued. "We've received multiple reports that this property is operating as a business in violation of HOA bylaws. Advertising. Accepting guests. That's unauthorized." Lydia appeared in the doorway, holding a manila folder with one hand and a glass of sweet tea in the other. "Care for something to drink?" she asked, sweetly enough that it sounded almost like a challenge. "It's been a busy day. We've had inquiries from a travel writer and a retired teacher who saw our preview online." Delilah ignored the offer. "We're not interested in online opinions. We're interested in compliance." Hazel took the folder from Lydia and offered it to Delilah. Signed by the town clerk in 1974. Mixed-use designation. Never revoked. Delilah flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the document as if it might dissolve under scrutiny. Garrett leaned in, reading over her shoulder. His brows rose, and he didn't say anything, but he didn't back away either. "The HOA has evolved since then," Delilah said sharply. "Our expectations have grown." "So have our roots," Hazel replied. "And we've got deeper ones than your bylaws." Two neighbors walked by on the sidewalk, Mr. and Mrs. Langley from the Old Methodist Church, slowing just enough to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Langley gave a subtle nod toward Hazel. Mr. Langley tipped his cap, then kept walking. Delilah straightened her clipboard. "You're deliberately provoking the board." Hazel gestured to the porch. "I'm preserving what's good before someone files it into the ground." Garrett cleared his throat, shifted his weight. "The documents are valid. If the town hasn't amended them." Delilah shot him a glance. "That's not your call." "No," Garrett said quietly. "But it is theirs." The silence that followed was taut as laundry line on a windy day. Delilah's grip on the clipboard tightened, but she stepped back without another word. Hazel didn't move until Delilah turned down the walk, heels scraping faintly as they caught in the uneven dirt. Garrett remained, eyes flicking from the house to his aunt's retreating back. "She's not done," he said after a pause. "No," Hazel agreed. "But neither are we." Lydia joined her on the porch, arms crossed. "I posted a new photo this morning. Got more likes than my last 3 professional campaigns combined." "Good," Hazel said. "It means people still recognize real." Inside, the cinnamon pecan bread had cooled just enough to slice. Hazel wrapped a few pieces in wax paper and tucked them into a basket for Ivy, who'd promised to swing by later with a jar of pear preserves. She set aside a slice for Garrett too, though she wasn't sure if he'd come back today. The porch, freshly swept, caught the last rays of sun like it was soaking up strength. The handmade Hazel's hearth sign gleamed softly in the fading light. Hazel sat for a moment with her tea, watching the wind toss the leaves along Maple Lane, one eye on the gate. That evening, Hazel finds a red envelope in her mailbox, full HOA compliance hearing scheduled, November 14th. Garrett lingered in the front room longer than usual. "Is that your grandmother's Bible?" he asked, gesturing to the mantel. The leather-bound book rested there quietly, flanked by an oil lamp and a small wooden box filled with dried dogwood petals. Hazel looked up from folding linen napkins, the ones edged with delicate hand-stitching. "She kept guest names in it when she hosted traveling singers," she said. Said hospitality and scripture belonged on the same shelf. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, lending a low hum to the room. Lydia passed through with a pine-scented sachet, tying it gently to the knob of the guest room door. "Each one's different," she said. "Lavender in the attic room. Pine in the west window. Heritage stays should smell like stories." Garrett stepped closer to the mantel. His jacket smelled faintly of wood smoke. "This doesn't feel disruptive," he said quietly. "I expected something louder." Hazel tilted her head. "Some places don't raise their voice. They let their welcome do the talking." At just past 3, a dusty blue sedan rolled up the driveway. The passenger door opened, and out stepped a woman with a straw hat tucked under her arm and a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. "Judith Bennett," she introduced herself as Hazel opened the porch gate. "I hope I'm early." "You're exactly on time," Hazel said, taking the satchel and smiling. Inside, Judith paused just past the threshold, eyes wide. "It smells like memory," she whispered. "Warm bread. Real wood. Is that a butter churn lamp?" Lydia grinned. "Found it at the county fair 3 years ago." Garrett offered to carry her second bag upstairs, and Judith thanked him with a nod. "Not often you meet a helpful HOA volunteer," she added with a wink. He hesitated before answering. "Not often you meet a guest who makes the house feel more like itself." As the sun dipped behind the trees, the 3 women gathered in the front room. Judith sat wrapped in one of Ivy's heirloom quilts, cradling a mug of cider. Hazel had set out slices of gingerbread and little saucers of candied pecans. "I was a librarian for 41 years, Judith said. "Retired early to chase old stories before they vanished." "You found one," Lydia replied. Judith smiled. "I think I walked into one." Later that night, while Lydia tidied the kitchen and Hazel stoked the fire, Judith pulled out her tablet and typed a short review for a regional travel forum. "This inn is the soul of Southern memory. Nothing artificial, nothing borrowed. Just warm light, deeper roots, and the hush of history well kept." In the hallway, Lydia paused by the blank wall outside the guest room and touched her fingers to the smooth paint. "We should make a memory wall," she said aloud. "Photos, recipes, handwritten notes. A thread of who we are." Hazel nodded. "Start it tomorrow. Before too much becomes yesterday." In the morning, Judith signed the guest book in graceful cursive. "I came for the nostalgia, but I leave inspired to preserve it." She added a tiny sketch of a pine tree in the corner, then quietly tucked a pressed magnolia leaf inside the next page. Hazel gave her a jar of homemade jam for the road and watched as the car disappeared down the lane. Not long after, Delilah sat at her kitchen table flipping through her printout queue. She stopped at a new review, Judith's, freshly printed from a concerned board member's forwarded link. Her eyes narrowed at the words underlined in red. "Unauthorized guest business, evidence submitted." Ivy arrived with a dusty box and a wide smile. "It was in my attic, under the picnic blankets." She plunked it down on Hazel's dining table, puffing dust into the warm afternoon light. The box had that smell of old linen and basement wood, a scent Hazel hadn't breathed in since before Earl passed. Hazel peeled the top open gently, like opening a letter from someone long gone. Inside, tucked beside faded newsletters and a curling photograph of a church bake sale, was a folded map, a handwritten application, and a brittle draft titled Brookwell Heritage Trail, 1982. "I thought this was lost," Ivy said, tapping the corner of the document. "My Roy drafted it. Whole idea was to link all the original homes, porches, general store, even the schoolhouse ruins." Hazel spread the papers across the table, careful not to smudge the faded ink. "He always had good ideas." Frank wandered in not long after, carrying a thin photo album and a half-eaten slice of pumpkin pie in a store clamshell container. "Don't judge me," he said, holding up the pie. "It's from the grocery, not scratch. I'm not proud." Lydia laughed and took it from him, adding it to the already crowded table: scanned guest notes, framed recipes, jars of preserved jams lining the center like a homemade museum exhibit. "We'll put this in the archive under honest efforts," she teased. Frank slid a black and white photo across the table. "That's your porch, Hazel. 1963, my father helped lay the stone path, bare hands and a bottle of lemonade between them." Hazel picked up the picture, her fingertips trembling just enough to make the edges shiver. "We forget," she said softly. "But the porches remember." Garrett arrived an hour later, sans clipboard. He carried a small thermos and a notepad and looked more like someone coming to a study group than a compliance check. "What's all this?" he asked, taking in the spread. "Memory," Hazel replied. "And evidence." Lydia had already begun scanning documents into a folder labeled Brookwell Archive, Living Edition. She clicked through windows on her laptop, her eyes dancing across timestamps and auto-filing systems. Garrett sat at the edge of the table, watching quietly. "You know," he said after a long moment, "Delilah isn't blocking this because it's illegal. She's blocking it because it scares her." Hazel glanced up. "She wants sameness because it feels manageable," he added. "She sees anything different as chaos. And you? You're a story she can't edit." There was a stillness in the room after that. Not silence, just stillness, like the air was listening. Hazel placed a tray of sweet potato casserole on the sideboard and lit a beeswax candle on the table. The smell of brown sugar and nutmeg filled the space like a hymn. After dinner, while the last of the jam jars were labeled and stacked, Hazel took out a pen and wrote a note on thick cardstock. She read it once, twice, then slid it into her coat pocket. The next morning, she pinned it to the community bulletin board beside the diner's front door. "Got old stories of Brookwell? Photos? Recipes? We're collecting pieces of who we were. Drop them at Hazel's hearth or leave them right here. Let's remember ourselves together." By noon, 2 handwritten notes had already been added beneath it with pushpins. One recalled a 4th of July parade in 1971, the other, a recipe for pear preserves from someone named Clara W. That evening, back at Hazel's house, Lydia taped Polaroids to the hallway wall, guests past and present, their names scrawled beneath in gentle ink. Judith with her book. Frank holding up the porch photo. Even Garrett, caught mid-laugh beside a pie box. The fire glowed low. Hazel sat in her favorite chair, reading through Roy's original trail proposal, nodding at the names of long-gone homes and barely remembered alleyways. As the clock struck 6, the mail flap thumped against the floor. Hazel rose slowly, slippers quiet on the wood floor. She picked up the envelope, a sharp, official red. It read: "Final review scheduled, possible legal sanctions pending." The chairs at the Brookwell Community Hall squeaked in protest as the townsfolk settled in. On the front table, Delilah laid out a stack of printed HOA citations like playing cards. She smoothed each one flat, lining them up with clinical precision. The overhead lights flickered once, then held steady, casting a pale wash over folded arms and guarded expressions. Hazel sat near the center, flanked by Lydia on one side and Garrett on the other. She folded her hands around her grandmother's knitted gloves, the yarn worn thin in the palms. "If they fine me for color," she whispered, "they'll need to charge half the leaves in town." Ivy and Frank sat a row back, their faces unreadable. Judith, visiting for the weekend, clutched a thermos of cider and scanned the room with a librarian's quiet scrutiny. The reporter from the Brookwell Echo perched near the aisle, pen poised, glasses glinting. Delilah stepped forward. "This special session has been called," she said crisply, "to address a rogue operation within our district, an unpermitted business that undermines our standards." She gestured to the citations, her voice sharp. "Multiple violations, unregulated lodging, signage out of compliance, community disruption." Hazel rose slowly. "I thought this was a town where we encouraged neighbors to open their doors." Delilah's smile was tight. "This isn't about sentiment, Ms. Monroe. This is about structure." Lydia stood and connected her tablet to the projector. The screen behind Delilah flickered to life. "This," she said, clicking to the first slide, "is the original zoning map, 1974. It marks Hazel's property as mixed use, signed by the city clerk." Another click. "This is a legal memo from that same office last week, confirming that designation still stands." More slides followed, guest testimonials, pictures of the porch through the decades, even a note from the Brookwell Historical Committee acknowledging the site as a potential heritage landmark. Delilah opened her mouth, but Garrett stood before she could speak. "I'd like to share something," he said. "I've been part of the HOA since I was 25. My aunt," he nodded toward Delilah, "taught me about order. But in the past year, I've seen citations issued without board votes. I recorded some of those conversations." He pulled a small device from his pocket. A moment later, Delilah's voice echoed through the room. "No need to check the board. Just send the letter. If we wait for consensus, we'll lose control." Gasps spread like wind over dry leaves. Delilah flushed but didn't speak. Ivy stood next. Her voice was low but clear. 2 months after I buried my husband, I received a notice. My porch flowers were too bright. I remember thinking, how could joy be a violation? The room went still. Frank rose beside her. "They made me tear down a birdhouse. My grandson built it. Said it was whimsical." One by one, voices lifted. A woman spoke of being told to repaint her fence the week her daughter returned from surgery. A man remembered a notice demanding his antique flag be removed. Judith raised her hand. "I've stayed in historic homes from Georgia to Vermont. But none held their town in them quite like this one." Delilah stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. "You don't understand. If we allow this softness, there'll be chaos." Hazel turned to face her. "What you call chaos, we call character." Lydia took Hazel's hand. Garrett stepped forward. "This isn't rebellion," he said, looking out at the crowd. "It's remembering who this town is." The board chair, a soft-spoken woman with silver-streaked hair, stood. "We've heard enough. As acting chair, I call for a vote on Delilah Crane's leadership." Delilah's clipboard trembled in her grip. "You don't have the authority." "Then let the town decide," said a voice from the back. Hands began to rise. Ivy. Frank. Judith. The Langley couple. One by one, nearly every hand lifted. Garrett's was the last. The board chair nodded. "By majority, Delilah Crane is removed from office, effective immediately." Delilah stared at them, then at the table, where her clipboard still lay. She didn't pick it up. She turned without a word and walked down the center aisle. Her heels struck the wood-like metronome ticks, faster, then uneven, then gone. Hazel remained standing. The light from the window warmed her cheek. "Brookwell deserves better," she said quietly. Afterward, no one rushed to leave. The community table was opened. Cornbread muffins. Pies from every oven on Maple Lane. Cider poured into paper cups. People lingered, some to share stories, others just to sit beside someone who'd been quiet too long. The reporter from the Brookwell Echo snapped a photo near the guest ledger. Hazel, Lydia, and Garrett stood side by side, each with a hand resting gently on the open book. Hazel tucked a sprig of rosemary into the porch railing, the way her mother used to before Thanksgiving. For memory, she whispered. The scent curled into the cool December air, blending with cedar, cinnamon, and the faint sugar tang of fresh pie. Hazel's hearth had never looked more itself. Garlands of cedar and pine looped along the porch columns. Lanterns hung in pairs, glowing softly against the gray dusk. Handmade ornaments, scrap fabric stars, painted clothespins, slices of dried orange, danced gently whenever the wind passed through. A small bronze plaque now stood at the gate, set in local stone. Brookwell Heritage Site, EST 1894. Lydia stood nearby, adjusting the last of the paper snowflakes taped inside the front windows. Think it'll snow tonight? Hazel tilted her head. Might just hold off till morning. Give the pies a chance to settle. From the driveway came the creak of an old station wagon and the clatter of laughter. Ivy stepped out first, ushering a small group of elementary schoolers toward the porch, each child clutching a clipboard and a tiny flashlight. All right, ducklings, she said cheerfully, heritage isn't dusty, it just speaks slow. Frank followed close behind, carrying a folding table and a stack of mismatched mugs. He winked at Hazel. You ready? Hazel nodded. I've been ready for 50 years. Just didn't know I'd need cider and music to prove it. By 6, the porch was alive. Paper lanterns glowed like low stars, and steam rose from crockpots full of cider and spiced apples. Lydia organized a short showcase of porch songs, a fiddler, a 12-year-old with a banjo, even Frank humming harmony with his granddaughter on a hymn no one had sung since 1973. Inside, the guest rooms glowed with soft lamplight. Ivy guided the children through the hallway, pointing out the framed recipes, the butter churn lamp, and Lydia's ever-growing wall of Polaroids. One little boy squinted up at a photo of Garrett balancing a tray of muffins. He works here too, he asked. Sort of, Ivy said, smiling. He's part of why we still have here. Out on the porch, Garrett arrived just as the cider mugs were being refilled. He wore a scarf Hazel had knitted last winter, the color still stubbornly called pumpkin even if he insisted it was burnt amber. Fresh from the orchard stand, he said, holding up a jug. Hazel poured him a cup and gestured to the porch steps. Still with the HOA? Garrett shook his head. Joined the city planning committee last week. Thought it was time to build things, not just police them. Good, Hazel said. We need more builders. Lydia appeared beside them with a cinnamon stick and a gleam in her eye. Also, I got invited to speak at the Preservation Summit in Knoxville next spring. Hazel raised her eyebrows. They saw the archive site, Lydia added. And Judith forwarded my blog to someone on the committee. Hazel smiled. Granny Monroe would have brought the jam jars and clapped loud. As the music wound down and pie crumbs were swept off the railing, Hazel took her seat in her rocker. She wore her mother's apron, a dogwood bloom tucked into the front pocket. Behind her, the hallway glowed with Polaroid snapshots and hand-scrawled names. The townsfolk gathered at the bottom step. Ivy held something wrapped in brown paper, tied with homespun string. Frank stepped forward and untied the ribbon. Inside, a hand-carved wooden sign, dark-stained, the lettering soft but strong. For preserving not just a home, but our story. Hazel reached out with both hands, cradling the sign like it was made of breath and memory. No one spoke for a long moment, but everyone felt the air shift, like the town itself had exhaled. The next morning, as Hazel brewed her tea, a letter arrived in the mail. Lydia read it aloud, holding it at the edge of the breakfast table like a sacred thing. From the Southern Heritage Association, we'd be honored to archive your family guest book and accompanying records. Would you be open to sharing your porch with the world? Hazel didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, where the last leaves clung to the bare maple trees like whispers. Garrett poured coffee. Ivy handed her a folded shawl. Lydia reached for her camera. Hazel took her seat in the rocker, the sign now mounted beside the front door, the porch bathed in soft morning gold. Lydia stepped back, raised the old Polaroid, and pressed the shutter. The camera flash captured her smiling, a still frame of legacy, defiance, and love. The wind over Brookwell had changed, not with noise or banners, but with the quiet resolve of neighbors who remembered who they were. Hazel never raised her voice, she simply opened her door, and others followed. When rules are used with care, they bind a town together. When they become tools of fear, they unravel even the neatest lawns. Maybe you've known a porch like Hazel's, a place where welcome came before worry. And maybe it's time, once again, to plant rosemary and remember.